Hey, Laura, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So I'm really excited to have you because selfishly, I'm in the process of writing my second book, and you help people figure out how to write a book. I know a lot of people have been in places where they hear people say, you should write a book or you should tell that story. Funny little side tangent before we get started. The other day I was cleaning up some old website stuff of mine, and I found the first blog post that I ever wrote, which was in 2009, and it wasn't very good. And but I started out by saying, I'm not a very good writer. That was the very first line. And and it's so interesting now to think back on that and where kind of things have gone now, which is really fun. And I'm excited to hear your story of, how you got into the world that you're in now. So tell us a little about your entrepreneurial journey.
Well, I was not entrepreneurial at all to begin with. I grew up in a pretty conservative family. I didn't know anybody in entrepreneurship, and I got into the traditional publishing world straight out of university. I'd done a writing and publishing degree and landed a job as a publicist in one of the big publishing houses. And so that was sort of a dream come true at the time, and I loved it, learned a lot. But in 2011, about 70% of my company got laid off. This was around the time that Amazon was really taking over, Kindle was becoming a really big deal, and a lot of the traditional companies were really struggling to adapt to the new environment. And while I kept my job in that particular scenario, I thought, this is not sustainable. I've got to figure out a way that I'm going to be a little bit buffered from these changes. And so I sort of started researching content marketing and writing on behalf of clients, writing for websites, that kind of thing. And so in 2012, I really started doing that. And by 2013, I had quit my job and moved overseas and was just sort of trying to write full time. A client of maybe a year or two down the line said, "You used to work in publishing, right?" And I was like, "Yes." And he said, "Well, would you write a book for me?" And I thought, well, it can't be that hard. It's kind of just a long form version of what I've already been doing. And, I had worked so closely with so many authors during my time at the publishing house that I thought, I've heard all of the stories. I know what they did. I'm going to give it a shot. And that project went so well that I decided that I was just going to try and focus on that. And so within a year or so, I'd completely shifted my business to just doing books. And here we are several years later, still loving it and still trucking along.
That's awesome. I love to hear the transitions of people who, started out the traditional path and then kind of ended up in entrepreneurship, sometimes almost by chance, it seems. Yes. And I didn't have that path. I started as an entrepreneur from the very beginning, essentially. So I'm always curious what those transitions looked like when you go from like this very structured, I work for somebody especially if it's a big company, and then what that is like kind of running your own ship. So in doing that, obviously you have a particular skill set, which is writing. And along the way, when you start a business, you realize very quickly it's not just about doing the thing, whatever the thing is, whether it's baking cupcakes or writing. It's not just about that anymore. You have to do all these other things. Like you got to sell new clients and you've got to track the sales and you got to deal with taxes and accounting and all this other kind of stuff. So as you started to figure those things out, were there any places where you kind of hit roadblocks? You're like, I didn't know I was going to have to deal with this. This is kind of an unexpected piece of the puzzle.
I think I wouldn't say that anything was totally unexpected because I got into some online forums pretty early and had a really good community of people around me early on that were really supportive and sort of shared a lot of what they had gone through. So nothing came as a total surprise, but I did feel extremely daunted by a lot of the things that I had to tackle and really ignored them for a long time because I just thought like, hopefully if I don't deal with it, maybe it'll go away. Not how it tends to go, but certainly, I sort of like you were saying that you have had this belief about yourself early on that you're not a good writer. Mm-hmm. Well, really, it's the same in any skill set. And, I had this perception of myself that I wasn't good with my numbers. And so it took me a long time to look at, the accounting and the profit and loss statements and like get comfortable and familiar with all of that stuff. So again, it's something that over time and with the right help has really changed, and now I feel totally comfortable with it. I can look at a statement and go, okay, I can see where things are at and what I need to focus on, what to get rid of. Fine. But I think a lot of the growth that happens in entrepreneurship is about unpacking these beliefs you have about yourself, and that, I mean, that's going to continue to be the case, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that that's so true. The idea of really self-awareness too is such a, I think it's a superpower for people to be successful in business, is really knowing themselves. Because if you don't know yourself, it's hard to know anybody else around you either. So I think that's super interesting. On your homepage of your website, it says, the world needs your story. Tell me about that idea and why you kind of said this is the headline. This is the thing I want people to focus on when they first come here.
I think entrepreneurs today are our cultural heroes. You know, they are the people that we idolize and look up to and want to be like when we grow up, where previously maybe that was sports people or maybe musicians. You know, entrepreneurs have really reached that same level of cult following that people from other industries used to occupy. And in the same way that it seems inaccessible for most people to become a professional athlete or a professional musician, it seems unattainable for many people to become entrepreneurs, especially if you don't see anybody that looks like you, if you don't see anybody that thinks like you or comes from where you come from. You know, if there's nobody around you telling you that you can do this, that it's possible for you, it just is a pipe dream, right? And the thing is that every entrepreneur has come from somewhere. A lot of us didn't come from money, didn't come from a great education, didn't come from a place of lots of powerful connections. And so to share those stories makes that process accessible to everybody. I'm really of the view that entrepreneurship is an incredibly powerful vehicle for creating equality in our communities, empowering people who maybe weren't empowered previously. It's just such a powerful tool to show other people, hey, like, this is possible for you too. And that's an incredible change to be able to create in people, right? Like, that's the transformation that I want to have happen for anybody who reads one of the books that I work on, to think, like, even if they're starting from a place where they're already kind of successful or they're already happy or whatever, to see that something else is possible is ultimately my goal every time.
I think that's so good. A couple things that you said both there and then earlier you said, when I asked you what surprised you, you said, well, I had a communities of people that I kind of connected with, so I wasn't as surprised. And then there you said, like, you need to have somebody else who can tell you that it's possible for you too. And it's so interesting how that alignment is, because we've never met, we've never talked before, except for 15 minutes ago. And I always say everybody needs 4 people in their life: somebody to look up to, somebody to stand beside them, someone who's looking up to them, and someone who believes in them when they don't believe in themselves. Yes. And you kind of like captured a lot of those ideas just within that phrasing, because I think there's a saying that a lot of people say, it's lonely at the top. And entrepreneurship can be very isolating because you feel like you're the only one who has to carry these particular burdens, and you're the only one who's working until 2 a.m. to try and make this thing work, and you're still not making any money at it, and you're not really sure what the outcome's going to be, and you think you're the only one who's struggling like that. And I think the truth is almost every entrepreneur has walked through that season. Yes. If they've lasted for any period of time, we've all had those days where we're like, was this a good idea? Like, why am I doing this? Yeah. Like, did you have moments like that? Did you have totally. Moments like that where you were trying to go?
I still have moments like that.
Me too.
I mean, I think, it would be lovely to be in an environment, in a situation where, like, nothing ever went wrong anymore. But, every new stage that you get to as an entrepreneur brings a new set of challenges, and it could always be easier, right? To just punch the clock on a job that you're qualified to do, it'd be so easy. It would have its own problems, but they wouldn't be the kind of existential problems that a lot of entrepreneurs face. I heard someone say a long time ago that there are 2 types of pain, and you get to choose which one you have. There's the pain of discipline, or there's the pain of disappointment. And, I'm not a huge believer that, like, every single part of your life must be super disciplined and there's got to be a rule for everything. I do think, though, that there's a discipline to taking risks and to exposing yourself to opportunities, it takes practice, it takes courage, and those things do require a little bit of discipline to force you across into action. And I'd rather face that than disappointment. And I think, that's, for me, what makes all of those moments worth it, those moments of like, it could be so much easier, is knowing I get to call the shots on my life. And at the end of the day, I'll know that I've done everything within my power to make my life as interesting and fulfilling as possible.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because, the idea is that entrepreneurs are these like high risk people, but a lot of them are actually kind of scared to take the next step. And I think it is important to ask that question of not just like, what's the worst thing that could happen if this happens, but what's the worst thing that could happen if I don't do this thing?
Right.
Like,
yes.
Then what,
Yeah.
And that sounds really negative to phrase it that way, but at the same time, consciously, we do make choices primarily to avoid pain and fear. And so if we realize that by not doing a particular, by not trying something that is kind of a dream or a wish or an aspiration, we're creating just as much risk for ourselves in regret and disappointment, because there's really there's not a whole lot worse than regret, because it's usually something you can't go back and change. And I always tell people, I'm like, look, if you run out of money, you can go get more of it. That's the beauty of the world that we live in today. There's more opportunity than there's ever been. And so we have the ability to go make more money. But when you spend all your time, it's gone. And nobody gets to get that back. I don't care how much money they have. So I think that's really important. Let's get really practical and talk about like the actual subject of writing. As I said earlier, my very first blog post, I basically led with something to the effect of, I'm not a very good writer, but I'm going to do it anyway. And what I really meant was that I'm not good. I probably wasn't a good writer then either, but what I really meant was that I'm not good at spelling and grammar. And I think when I wrote my first book, what I didn't realize was I just thought like a copy person is a copy person. And I didn't realize that there are all these different kinds of people who have different skill sets, from somebody who's an actual like long form writer, and somebody who's like a structure editor, and somebody who's a copy editor. And there's all these different pieces of the puzzle. So if let's just say I haven't written a book, I don't know anything about these things, and I want to write my first book. What are some of the things I need to think about in that first process of going, hey, how do I get this idea turned into something people can read?
So I specifically work with entrepreneurs who are wanting to write books about their businesses. So that will always kind of inform my answer here. What I'm looking for is that people have spent some time thinking about what the strategic intent of the book is going to be. So going back to what I was saying earlier, what is the transformation you're trying to create for your reader? What do you want them to go away from this book understanding, believing? What is it that you're trying to change in that person, and why? How is this going to fit within the marketing infrastructure of your existing business? What's your plan for using it? Why are you doing this is kind of what I want to hear first. But then, you're looking more for themes, right? I'm not so worried about specific details, specific stories as the overarching ideas that are going to drive this book forward. Every book needs a narrative structure. People are very responsive to storytelling. It's much more effective than just listing a bunch of facts. So you do want to have some sort of narrative that ties the entire thing together. But it's more important to think about the themes than the tiny details. I think where people get stuck a lot of the time is trying to include all the information into one single book. Not everything belongs in one book. There will be plenty of good information that you have that doesn't actually fit for this project, and you need to save that for another one. And so I think part of my role is to help people filter what belongs in which book. So if you're writing a book about personal development, then certainly maybe some stories about your family are important and were formative, but do they serve that transformation goal that you have for your reader? Maybe not. And so that, collection of stories might belong in a different project, for example. So, there's plenty of things like that. And it's hard not to get really into the weeds when you're sort of thinking about these things. But I could make this work. And if I wedge that in a little bit, I can, use that. It's very tempting to try and fit everything in, but it just becomes this kind of Frankenstein. And you really want it to be You want your message to be as clear as possible and unmistakable so that the person reading goes away with a very clear sense of what the point of all of this was, and that they know, like, and trust you by the end of it because you've been so specific and so open about what you know about this particular area.
Yeah, I love all those ideas. Interesting. I actually made the mistake. I don't know if it was a mistake in hindsight. It actually has worked out perfectly fine. But when I wrote my first book, Building a Business That Lasts, same title as the podcast, what I failed to do was really align the book with the agency that I run in a way that would actually benefit our clients. But then I realized in hindsight, I wasn't writing it for that purpose. I was writing it because I wanted to help somebody who wasn't actually even to the level where they were our client yet in many cases. And now, interestingly, that's going to play really well into some future coaching work that we're going to be doing. But that was kind of happenstance backwards, around. When I wrote my first book, I had a writing coach basically that helped me, which was instrumental. And to your point of like not knowing what should be shorter and what should be longer, what she really helped me with was those things. There were times where she would take a page and be like, okay, this page should be a sentence. Like, yeah, it's fine, but this should be very little information. You wrote a whole page, it needs to be a sentence. Or she'd be like, okay, this sentence needs to be a page. There would be some times like that. She never actually wrote anything for me. She just forced my writing to be a certain way, because I find that writing, just like speaking, is actually really easy for me. The problem is the editing. It's sure. Narrowing it down into what needs to be there. I don't even really mean, for people that are listening, I don't really mean editing like where a comma should be and what the grammar should be, although I need help with that too. I mean, like, does this idea connect to this idea, and is that the right order of things? Does that need to be moved around? I noticed when I was looking at the kind of the primary areas that you do, you list ghostwriting, editing, and coaching. So talk a little bit about the difference between those three things. I'm especially interested in the ghostwriting idea because I know a lot of business leaders have a ghostwriter, and I think some people feel like that's cheating, but maybe talk about why it's not.
So, I mean, this is the thing that comes up all the time. I think, to my mind, ghostwriting is just a much more effective way of telling your story. If you run a business and you run a big company, you're not trying to do your company's taxes yourself. Right? That's somebody's specific job because it's complicated. It takes work. It takes a very clear familiarity with what's required. Let that expert do it, And it's the same with writing your book. Most entrepreneurs are very busy. They have very high demands on their time. Writing a book when it's not their primary skill set is not the highest and best use of their time. It's not the most profitable use of their time. Their time would be better spent generating the audience that is going to benefit most from this book, so that there's a return on the project for them and it has the impact that they're hoping it will have. Ghostwriting is basically a process of me inhabiting the other person for 6 months and bringing their story the way they want to tell it to the market. I don't want myself to be present in any of those books. It shouldn't sound like me. It shouldn't read like me. It should sound very much like the client, because
because you don't sound like me at all.
Right, exactly. And that's not the idea. It's not someone outside looking in and telling your story. It's you looking out and telling it through somebody else as your mouthpiece. And so part of that process is very immersive. I spend a lot of time interviewing the client and recording those calls. And I use all of those conversations as the foundation of the draft. So, obviously that will get polished and filled out and everything. But as much as I can, I try to use verbatim what the client says. So it really is their words. It really is their stories. I am just the one scribing away in the corner. It's their story. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into getting those conversations to being a published book that's sitting on a shelf somewhere. But I don't think it's cheating at all. I think it's a very effective, very high leverage strategy for actually creating an asset in your business that you can be really proud of.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just to be clear, I don't think it's cheating, but I've heard people say that before.
Yeah,
I think that I may have thought it was cheating at some point, but at the same time, that makes complete sense, because I always tell people, like, you need to focus on your best and highest use. You need to focus on where your strengths are. And writing is a very high skill set. Like, it requires a lot of skill, and the experience that you have has a big impact on the quality of the outcome. And so, like, there's no question to me that my first book would have been better if I'd had somebody write it for me. I'm just the kind of person that I wanted to get in and do it myself. And it also was a good exploration for me because of the kind of work that we do with helping other people grow their business. It was even the one I'm working on now is a good practice. Although I'm attempting to do it myself right now and thinking I probably need somebody to help me.
There is a huge amount of value in doing it yourself, particularly if there's a personal component to it. It can be very cathartic. It can be very clarifying. You know, there's a lot that, you know, you can be very fulfilled by doing this kind of project yourself. And I always tell people, if there's a memoir aspect, some personal story that you need to get out, it's quite possible it's better for you to be the one to do it. But if it's specifically focused on your business, and sure, your personal story is always going to play into that, then I think don't waste your time, you know, get a writer. It doesn't, you know, obviously ghostwriting is a pretty small field. There are not that many of us compared to other types of writers, but, you know, the people who are working in this field are very experienced. You know, most of us have 15, 20 years experience writing, you know, for clients, you know, as somebody else. You know, most of us have gone to university to do writing degrees. We've worked in publishing. Like, we have a very strong grasp. Whereas, you know, like you were saying, you've always been an entrepreneur. I couldn't hold a candle to what you're able to do in terms of growing somebody else's business, you know, through Go Systems. So I don't think there's any shame in saying, well, that's not a skill set I've developed, but that's an outcome that I want. And so I'm going to hire somebody to get it for me.
Yeah, I totally believe that. I think that's great. It's the same thing as, you know, it's very rare that, like, Stephen King's going to record his own audiobook, right? He's not a narrator. He's a writer. He's a very good writer. And so he's going to write his books, then he's going to hand it off to a narrator. I just listened to one of his books the other day. That's why it came top of mind. And the narrator was so good that, I mean, he was able to change voices for each character. It was just spectacular narration.
It makes a huge difference. Right.
It was huge. It, like, fully immersive experience. It was almost like there were different voice actors. He was so good. And I thought, because at the beginning I was like, because I had not listened to one of his books before. I thought, I wish he was narrating this. And then I'm like, no, I really don't. He's a writer. He's not a narrator. You know? So unless they're great at that, why do that? Let somebody else be the reader. Let somebody else be the writer. It can still be your story. It can still be true. It can still be authentic. It can still be you. And ultimately, if somebody's reading it back, they can go, I wouldn't say it that way. I mean, because I know for me, I've not had somebody written a book, but I've had plenty of people write blog posts for me. And there are times, or even emails, where I'll go back and read those email chains and go, actually, we did this yesterday. We were going through some emails that had been written, and they were from me, but they weren't really from me. And I thought, I wouldn't say that way. Like, let's change that. And then whoever's writing it is going to learn from that too, and go, okay, you're right. I need to think about how you would say that, you know, in those scenarios.
Yeah. And that's something that we go through a lot in the editing phase of a ghostwriting project. So I take all these interviews, put it into a draft, and then the next phase is to go into editing. So at that stage, I want the client to read everything I've written and point out any places where they think, I probably wouldn't say it like that. Or point out, you know, areas where there are gaps, or I've got a timeline wrong, or whatever. You know, I want them to go through it very closely so that it is as accurate to their life as possible. It is as authentically them as possible. I don't want there to be any moment where the reader thinks, that's a weird, like, break in the tone, or, you know, I don't want anything to distract the reader from, you know, the client themselves. And, you know, a lot of that comes down to voice, which is, you know, as far as sort of tactics go, is a really important component that people who aren't professional writers might not think about. And voice is made up of tone, cadence, and vocabulary. So tone is, you know, are you very formal, or are you very chatty? Cadence is, do you speak in very short sentences or very long, wordy paragraphs? You know, what's the vocabulary you use? Is it, you know, aimed at people who have PhDs, or are you talking to somebody with a 6th grade education? You know, there's a lot of variation that goes into how different people communicate, and getting that voice, you know, that multi-part voice right is absolutely critical to making sure that a ghostwriting project delivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I always think when I'm writing, like for me personally, the way I write is the way I talk. So when I read a page back, it needs to sound like something I could get on stage and deliver. That's just how I like it to be, because I want it to sound like it's like I want them to hear my voice when I say it, you know?
Yes.
But not all writing needs to be like that. It just depends on the writer. It depends on the subject. It depends on all the different pieces of the puzzle. Um, I'd love to talk about, as people are trying to come up with ideas and they think, well, I'm not quite ready for a ghostwriter. Maybe I am, but I don't really know. How can they start to formulate some of their ideas ahead of time? So if they come to somebody like you kind of know, like, okay, it seems like they have kind of a general structure of what needs to happen, because they're not going to come to you and be like, hey, I want to write a book. And you're like, what do you want to write about? And they're like, I don't know.
You tell me.
So I doubt that happens anyway. But I guess what I'm asking is how can people best organize their ideas before they come to a writing coach to help kind of move things forward?
So what I like to see from a prospective client is a very clear understanding of who their audience is and what they need. I always ask, why you and why now? Why are you uniquely qualified to write this book and tell this story? And what is it that is happening in your life or your business or the world at the moment that is making you think, okay, yes, now's the time to do this? Then I want to look at your North Star idea. So what's that unifying concept, that narrative theme, the one thing that people can say in a sentence, this is what I learned from this book. Because not only does that give you a lot of clarity about the purpose of the book, it also gives you a filter. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, does this idea or this story or, this anecdote fit in this particular book? Does it fit that North Star idea? Yes or no? So it gives you a very quick way to determine what information belongs in this particular project. And then if they've got some clarity about, say, 10 to 15 big topics that they want to cover that can become the basis of chapters, then that's ideal. If they haven't got that far, that's okay, because we can work on that. But ideally, you'd have a pretty clear idea of everything that you want to hit on, even if it's just from kind of a high level, so that we have a jump off point. That might change over time. Those ideas might evolve, and that's perfectly fine. Every project does evolve, but at least if you have some starting ideas, some starting points specifically that you want to touch on, then it gives you some momentum at the beginning, which is really important.
That's really helpful. I like that idea of like really understanding who that audience is, because, and then you talked a lot about this idea of kind of a transformational identity, essentially. Like what do you want that person to be when they're done with the book? Who do they want to become ultimately is really the question.
Yes.
And is the content that you're going to provide them helpful? When we're writing marketing messaging, which is obviously a lot more short form, that we talk about this storytelling idea all the time. But what I always tell people is, and I'm curious how this resonates for you when writing a book, is I always tell people, when people used to come to me, they'd say, hey, Jay, we need help to tell our story as it relates to our marketing. And now I say, no, you don't. You need our help to invite your customer into a story, because ultimately we want the customer to be the one who's becoming transformed as a result of it. That's kind of what you're saying. You got to know who you're talking to, and then you got to know what you want for them. And then I think you have to kind of ask the question, like, do they want that? Because if they don't, they're not going to buy the book. I mean, is that kind of how you think about it too?
Yeah, I think if you get to a stage where you're thinking about writing a book, but you haven't got any sense of what your customer wants and need, probably you need to step back a couple ways. The audience in any marketing project, obviously, and I do consider a book a marketing tool.
Sure.
The audience always has to come first. Without the audience, you've got nothing. And so I think that's kind of a critical thing for people to understand. Everybody gets very caught up in what's the cover going to be? What's the title going to be? What should the subtitle be? And like, it doesn't matter. You can, like, that's all window dressing, honestly. Like, it's important, but it's stuff that can be tacked on at the end. The most foundational piece is to know and love your customer. And if you have that in place, then writing the book is going to be easy, because you know them, you know what they need. You can write the book to a particular customer. I do this all the time. If I'm writing, a book that I know will be helpful to somebody in my network, or, a friend of mine or somebody that I've encountered, I write the book with them in mind, like I'm writing them a letter. And it makes it so much easier, because I think, well, Rachel wouldn't care about that. She's not worried about that. I know that she's much more interested in this other outcome. So, okay, I need to shift this content a little bit so that it's more useful to what I know she actually needs. So writing with somebody in mind is a really useful way to get that piece working.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful for people to think about because I think the other thing that happens is, I know for me, regardless of where you're at in business as an entrepreneur, there's often this kind of imposter syndrome. It's been talked a lot more lately about of, am I really good enough, is ultimately what the question is. Like, do I have anything that people actually would want to hear about? Like, is there enough inside of me to actually write a book? And I think the answer for most people is almost always yes. Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think we so often have this kind of curse of knowledge where we perceive that everybody else knows everything that we know too, and they probably don't. And if nothing else, maybe they just need a similar perspective, or maybe they just need to hear from somebody who is walking through a similar season of business or life or whatever else. You mentioned earlier that a book can be a marketing tool, which is it sounds like a lot of what you do, because you're helping businesses kind of tell their stories or tell stories that affect their clients. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's a really interesting idea. A lot of people think, I'm going to write a book and then I'm going to sell that book and become a millionaire. Probably not going to happen. But, maybe, just like your son might also be in the NBA. Right. And because the reality is, like, there are a lot of books that get published every year. And I can tell you with my book, I have not made a ton of money on it. I have not sold hundreds of thousands of copies, but it has been an incredible reputation piece. It's been an incredible tool. And I know personally, I've had plenty of people tell me that it's helped them with their journey, and that's good enough for me. But as a marketing tool, let's talk about that. Like, tell me more about how you see a book for a business or for an entrepreneur being a tool that they can use in their marketing arsenal.
So, books have been around for 600 years. They are not a new tool, right? They're not a new artifact, but they're still extremely highly regarded in our society. If someone is a published author, we think, oh, that's a bit impressive. There's no, like, the sheen hasn't come off books, right? And no one is saying, like, are books dead? Like, clearly books are not dead. No one's having this conversation about, same with email marketing. Is that dead? Is social media dying? Is PPC dead? Like, these, clickbaity conversations come up all the time, but with books, they, when ebooks came about, there was a bit of a flutter about it. But honestly, books still carry so much weight in our collective view of the world that to publish one kind of puts you on a pedestal. And people often say that having a book is the ultimate business card. And honestly, I think that's understating it, because a business card is like a little insignificant thing that you're going to toss away eventually. But a book is real. You can hold it. There's weight to it. Sits on your shelf. There's that old saying that possession is 9/10 of the law. And so once somebody has possession of your knowledge in their hand, it's very unlikely that they're going to go looking for somebody else's. So this is super important, because when somebody reads your book and it sits on their bookshelf or on their Kindle, they see it all the time. They're physically engaged with you all the time. So the day that they realize I need a business coach, or I need an ads expert, or whatever, and they've got a book, that author is going to be the person that they go to directly, because they've got that ongoing interaction with it. It's top of mind, even if they don't realize it. The great thing with a book is that it can be used so many different ways. You can really implement it into any kind of existing marketing infrastructure that you have. There's no need to build whole new systems around it. It doesn't have to become this big thing in itself, although it certainly can. If you do email marketing, you can use it there. If you do PPC, you can use it there. If you speak from stage, you can use it there. Podcast, use it there. There's so many places that you can deploy it and repurpose that content that it really is kind of an asset that just keeps on spinning off revenue, really. And to your point about making money with it, it's unlikely that anybody's going to make a ton of a ton of revenue from the unit sales of their book. Even if you are getting a good royalty deal or whatever, most authors are going to be making a couple of bucks at most for every copy that they sell. And that's kind of an optimistic number. Where you make your money with a book is if you have a high ticket offer that you sell off the back of the book. And so this is kind of what I'm also looking for when a client comes to me, like, what's the most expensive thing that you sell? And is this book going to get more people to buy that thing? Mm-hmm. Because for a lot of the people I work with, selling one of their high ticket items would recoup the entire cost of the book project, right? And so that's a very easy calculation to do, because most people find that there's a drastic increase in their qualified leads after having released a book. One client who runs an advertising agency saw like a 3 times increase in her qualified leads within a month of her book releasing. And, the number of sales that were closing went up in tandem with that. And so suddenly she's like got 3 times the amount of revenue within a month. So that's a really interesting thing for people to realize, like the money isn't in the front end sales of the book. But the other thing to think about there is when the time is right for your business to do that, because as businesses scale, as I'm sure you know, inefficiencies scale too. Mm-hmm. And so if you're already struggling with customer support and customer communication, 3xing your customer lead flow is going to create problems, and it's going to lose the goodwill that maybe has been created from reading the book. So you want to make sure that your business is ready, that your systems are really working smoothly, you're good with your team, everybody knows that this is coming, you've got everybody is prepared for this, and that your systems are prepared for this. And this is why I will often say a book is not an early stage project for a lot of entrepreneurs. If you're 1 or 2 years into the book, start collecting your ideas, start getting to know your audience, definitely start building that foundation. But you really need to be up and running and very confident that you can deliver at a larger scale before you sort of hit go on this type of project.
Yeah, for sure. So much good counsel there. I think that the big idea for people to think about is how could that book then ascend into a higher level product? Yes. For us, that's exactly, how it works. And my thought process is basically one of 2 things. Either somebody's going to read the book and hopefully it adds value to their life, number 1, and they're not a prospect for us as a company, and that's totally fine. Yep. Or they're going to read the book and they're a prospect for our company, and the value that creates is exponential potentially. And, I think the other thing about a book is when you take the time to write a book, and put those ideas into paper, it's kind of depending on the subject, but really most of the time it can be really an evergreen subject. Yes. And it doesn't always have to be if something more niche or topical, but that idea that, like when I wrote the book that I wrote, that book is still going to be good information. There'll be a few things that maybe are out of date in 10 years, but it's still good information. And I could not have done it though in those early years. Well, 1, I wouldn't have had a whole lot to talk about, but 2, I just wouldn't have had the time, to your point of like, you have to have the right systems in place. I would say every business needs 4 kind of key P's to run their business. They need the right people, they need the right products, they need the right process, and they need the right promotion. And if they have all those pieces together, then they're in a place where they're going to have more freedom of time. So like today I'll record, 3 or 4 of these podcasts, and I'm not doing client work because there's a team that can do the client work. But back in the day, there's no way I could sit and record 3-hour-long podcasts, and I'm spending, 2 half days a week working on my new book right now. I couldn't have done that years ago, but now that I have the right people and the right processes in place, I can do all of that, and the exponential value that it creates is really huge. One thing that you talked about too that I want people to think about is this idea of kind of multiplying content. So I was saying to Laura earlier when we first started the show, I've started doing these on Facebook Live, which is not the primary goal of the podcast, but why not? Because, more people are going to see it there than maybe would see it on the podcast. And then we're also going to take this video and put it on YouTube. And so it will live there. And then we'll also take the audio and transcribe it. And now there's a written copy of everything that we've said. which is horrifying. I'm just kidding. And so now we have these 4 pieces of content from this 30 to 45-minute conversation. A book is very similar to that, but even more expansive. Because if you've written, you or your ghostwriter has written tens of thousands of words as it relates to your business, how many social posts do you have in there? How many blog posts do you have in there? How many things do you have in there that could become video scripts? Like, there's so much content that you just created for yourself for the next decade. My team could take my book and use that as our content plan for the next, 5 years and have plenty of stuff to work from. So I just love that idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about publishing? Let's talk about that a little bit, because there's a lot of confusion there. Do I have to have a publisher? Can I self-publish? What are the other options? Like, what's your guidance when you talk to people about that? Because most people have no idea. I didn't either, really.
So it really depends, again, on what your goal is for the book. If you want to be in airport bookstores and you want your name on posters and you want to be, reaching a mass audience, then I think pursuing traditional publishing can still be a really good option. To work with most publishers, you will need an agent. So most publishers will only deal with people who already have representation. So make sure you find an agent who's a good fit for the type of work you do. The kind of hack for that is to find a book that's similar to yours, go to the acknowledgements in the back and find the name of the agent, because most authors will name their agent in the acknowledgements. So you can then hunt them down, and if they say no, you can sort of ask them, okay, who else do you know that might be a good fit for this? And so you've got to go to the right people for that. And then it becomes the agent's responsibility to sell your book to a publisher. Once a publisher buys the rights to the book, then they're going to go through the whole sales and marketing process. Usually that takes 6 to 12 months once you've actually got a signed contract from a publisher. So if time is of the essence, then, working with a traditional publisher might not be the right move. But if you are looking for that kind of mass exposure, then definitely that's still a pretty good option. As far as self-publishing goes, I'm a little bit biased, but I love self-publishing just because there is that speed to market. So going back to that why now question, if it's now, not a year from now. So there's a lot of value in being able to get it out when you're ready. There's also a lot of value in being able to control all of the components of the publishing process yourself. So you get final say on the cover, you get final say on the title, you get to control all the marketing, you get to control where it's listed and what it sells for. And, all of those pieces are negotiable when you're working with a publisher, but they're down to you when you self-publish. So I like that aspect of controlling your own project. And particularly if you're using the book as a promotional tool for your business, that year-long lag time can be very frustrating, because you can't really do much except say it's coming. You can build a waiting list and get pre-sales and that kind of thing, but it's hard to generate real momentum from it in that kind of dead time while you're waiting for it to actually hit shelves. Whereas with self-publishing, you can do all of that list building and pre-promotion and everything while you're still working on the book, so that when the book is actually finished, you can just go straight into selling. There's none of the lag that you see with a traditional path. So for my money, if speed is important and control is important, then self-publishing is the better option. But, again, it really depends on what your goal is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I didn't have really a plan to have a publisher at the beginning. So I was like, well, I don't even know anything about that. So I'm just going to self-publish it, which is great because really 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. Like you couldn't, at least not at the way that it is now. I mean, there's still a lot of details to figure out, which is why it's good to have a coach or somebody that's walked through this before to help you figure these things out. But I do love the idea that like I have my book now and I can do whatever I want with it. Like I don't have to ask for permission. I own it. It's my book. If I want to change the cover, I'll change the cover. If I want to, take excerpts out and use it over here or turn it into a video series or whatever, I can do that. And so that's a great point to think about in all of that. How about, and then we're going to have to transition out because I could probably talk about this all day. Last question is people often think like, how much time do I need to invest? How much money do I need to invest in order to have a book that's produced, because I was surprised about all the little things I had to figure out. And I have designers on staff that can do design work for me, and I have copywriters on staff that I can use if I really needed to. And I have all these different things as a marketing agency that I have access to that most business owners do not. And so what are some things they need to think about regarding time and money before they do a book?
I mean, the answer is, again, it depends. There are a lot of components, as you say, particularly to the self-publishing model, that still require a lot of manual attention, and there's not really a clear one-size-fits-all process. So it certainly is simplified if you choose just to publish with Amazon instead of listing on all of the different sites that you can list on, but then also your distribution is limited. My projects take about 6 months, start to finish. So from the day that we have the kickoff conversation to the day that I hand over all of the how-to videos for all of the different platforms, and then your book is out selling in the world, it's usually about 6 months. Some people do it faster, some people do it slower, but I think that's probably a reasonable expectation if you're working with a ghostwriter and your project is the only one that they're working on. If you're working with somebody who is working across multiple projects, then obviously it's going to take longer. If you're working with an agency, again, they're going to be able to give you a specific timeline, but I think 6 months is probably a reasonable ask in most situations. As far as money goes, if you're looking for somebody who is young and scrappy and kind of just wanting to get in the door, then you could expect to pay 10 grand, 15 grand for a ghostwritten book. If you're wanting to hire the guy, who's written 20, 30, 40 books, won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative journalism, that's going to be more like 70, 80. And then there's a whole range in the middle. So I'm pretty squarely in the middle of that. And I think that it's important to think about the additional costs that happen along the way. So as you say, you have to have design done. You've got to have a cover. If you're going to publish print books in addition to your ebook and an audio book, then all of those cover requirements are going to be a bit different. So you've got to pay a designer for that. There are ISBNs and barcodes. So again, if you're printing physical books, ISBNs are just strings of numbers that are universal identifiers for your book, and barcodes obviously you need for physical sales. There are listing fees on some of the distribution platforms. You can pay for all kinds of marketing. Obviously, if you're a marketer yourself, then you're probably going to handle that in-house, but a lot of people will hire a launch specialist to put their book out into the world, so that's something to consider. Some people pay for reviews, which I don't really recommend, but that's something else that some people will pay for. And then any, paid advertising that you want to do to promote it. There can be a lot of costs associated, although they don't have to get sort of out of control if you know what you're doing at the beginning and can set your expectations about those things.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's one of those things that what I always tell people with any kind of marketing, especially if you're writing the book as a marketing vehicle, is you just have to ask the question, like, what's possible as a result of this?
Yes.
Well, how many clients do I need to acquire as a result of writing this book that would cover the cost and then put us in a positive position? Same thing with every other marketing tool that we use. And for some companies and some business leaders, that makes a lot of sense. And some go, you know what, that's something I'd like to do in 5 years. That's something I'd like to do in whatever time frame that they put on it. But what I would encourage everybody to do is I actually really believe that writing is something everybody should put some work into. Yes. Even if it's just a little journaling here and there that nobody ever sees, there's something so powerful. And it relates back to what I was saying at the beginning, when I went back and looked at some old blog posts that I had written that I'd totally forgotten about. There was something so powerful about going back and reading words that I wrote way back then. One of them was actually a letter that I wrote to our first daughter who we adopted. And at the bottom, I put, P.S., I'm not really writing this for the public. I'm writing it so that one day I'll read it again and be reminded of my expectations for myself as a father. And I was like, okay, like how powerful that is because I wrote it down and then saved that writing that I could go back and read. That has tremendous impact on me, and it'll probably have tremendous impact on her when she's 20 years old and goes back and reads that letter that I wrote when she was born.
Absolutely.
So now, since I transitioned a little bit there, let's kind of wrap things up with 3 key questions. I always like to ask about work-life balance. It means something different to everybody and something all entrepreneurs are kind of grappling with. The second is where people can find you online if they want to learn more about you and what you do. And the third is kind of any parting thoughts to help people build a business that lasts. So the first one, work-life balance. What does it mean to you, and how has that changed through different seasons of business and life?
For me, work-life balance is feeling like I have enough space in my life to be as generous as I want to be. Generous in my spirit. I'm not a religious person, but the ability to be giving to my partner, to my family, to my friends, that's really important to me, to be able to do that freely. And I know that if I'm grinding, digging too deep into my energy stores when I'm working, that sense of being able to be generous goes away. And so when I start to feel snippy when somebody asks me to do something, or when I start feeling like it's a big obligation to arrange something with somebody, or that to me is a warning sign that I'm draining too much energy from my business and from my work life, and that it's costing me in my personal life. So that is a really good marker for me. I just want to be able to be a joyful part of my community. And I think for me, I get a lot of energy from my work. And so there's a lot of value, that goes both ways. But it's very easy to feel like you constantly have to over deliver for clients. And you obviously have, for me, getting into this business was, I just want to be the best at my craft. Like, I'm very competitive with myself. I don't really care about what anybody else is doing in my industry. I want to be the best that I can be. And so I'm constantly pushing to, like, Ira Glass, who's the NPR host, talks about the gap between your taste and what you're able to produce. And so, you can have a really clear sense that your writing's just not quite where you want it to be. And so you push and push and push to get to that level. But again, that energy comes at a cost. And so there is this constant recalibration of how my energy gets deployed. But yeah, being able to be just joyful and generous is really important for me.
I love that.
Yeah.
What about where can people find you online? Where's the best place for them to go?
The best place is my website, which is lauraiswriting.com. And you can get a free copy of my book, which is all about the process that I use to ghostwrite books for clients. So you could take that as your playbook and do exactly what I do it for yourself.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go get a copy and take a look at it for sure. I thank you so much for being on the show today. Last thoughts, if you were to kind of speak into the life of another entrepreneur as we wrap up today, what would you tell them to give them some hope to build a business that lasts?
I would say that one of the most important things is to make sure what you're working towards is what you actually want, not a goal that you have picked up from somebody else, or that you think you quote unquote should want as an entrepreneur. It's very, very easy to take advice from people who run businesses who are completely different to yours, want businesses and want outcomes that are completely different to what you actually want for your life. And so you really do need to take the time to be still and to listen to what you actually want. And I think to your point about writing, that's a very powerful tool for getting clarity on that. It's surprising what comes out when you just sit down with a pen and paper. And sometimes when you look back at stuff that you wrote a few years ago, it can be very prescient. So yeah, make sure it's something that you want and not something you're sort of slaving away to that somebody else thinks you should want.
Absolutely. That's great counsel in all areas of business. Laura, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's been great.
Hey, I hope this video has helped you with some tips and ideas to build a business that lasts. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on the next videos that we roll out. And more importantly, for some awesome free resources, head over to our website at buildingabusinessthatlasts.com. You can get a free copy of my book there, where I tell you how I have built an agency that's grown year over year for the last 20 years in a row. So go grab that, buildingabusinessthatlasts.com, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks. We'll see you soon.